Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Fiona Wynn. Fiona is a business psychologist, independent consultant and startup co-founder who has extensive experience in people and culture, organisational development and experience design. Previously, Fiona was Head of Culture, Inclusion and Innovation at Australia Post, where she built strategies and platforms for cultural change around inclusion and innovation. This included design and deployment of an internal incubator program for diverse teams of talent to solve customer problems. Fiona has worked with leaders across a broad range of industries over the years, including manufacturing, banking, energy and logistics, through to the early stage startups solving unmet problems in new ways. She studied corporate innovation at Stanford Graduate School of Business and has a master's in organisational psychology from Monash. Nowadays, Fiona is the co-founder of a startup called Werkling, which connects on-demand professional talent with dynamic, future-ready businesses. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Fee.
Thanks, Claire.
I wanted to chat to you today because I love your philosophy around designing the workplace in the same way you would design a product, designing an experience for employees that they want to come to every day in a frictionless environment that helps them get their work done. I know it sounds like utopia, but when it comes to retention, the environment can have more of an impact than we think. But before we get to the questions, tell us a little bit about you and how did you get to where you are today?
So my career has predominantly been in the sort of people space. I've been very much working in sort of people and culture for too many years, over probably 20 years now. It really started with HR roles, working in more traditional HR business partner roles, and then very much moved into organisational development. My interest in psychology and human behaviour was there since my undergrad degree. I've always been fascinated by how systems and structures and cultures actually influence how people show up each and every day and how that impacts organisational productivity, how that influences the extent to which people feel like they belong in an organisation and how ultimately organisations can be really amazing from a customer perspective. I have this very strong belief around culture being very deeply aligned to brand. They are basically two sides of the same coin. And so my career has very much sort of gone in that direction around seeking to understand more about how the impact of human behaviour has on culture and therefore on brand and therefore organisations in general being high performing. So now I'm basically a free range spirit. I've been out on my own for over a year now since I left Australia Post. I've been independent consulting and freelance consulting to organisations in a whole range of industries. I absolutely love it. I've really taken that independent consulting experience to basically look at what are the problems to be solved out there in the market around people trying to connect their amazing, talent with businesses that actually need that talent and don't know they exist. And so my co-founder, Michelle, and I have started a company called Werkling, and we're in early beta phase at this point in time. But we're looking to really connect in a very human way business leaders who are trying to solve problems where they maybe don't have in-house capacity or capability to solve those problems, to connect those to the talent on the external world who can actually solve those.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned in what you just said around the people part and the connection side of things. And, I think a lot about organisations and the values and the belief systems. And I just wondered your opinion on how important those systems are in terms of the value they put on people in different roles and I guess how that sort of all comes together.
It's probably an area that a lot of people misunderstand, actually, when we think about belief systems. It can also be seen as, just corporate speak. But actually, at the heart of it, when I think about a belief system of an organisation, it's really about the organisational values. And those values are not those things that we see on a poster, that we see on a proposal, that we see on a website. I'm talking about the core values and beliefs of an organisation that actually are really deeply held. It's a collective belief, actually. It's something that can be so strong, and in a large organisation in particular, can stick around for a long time and actually be impermeable. I guess when I think about values of an organisation, it impacts on everything. It impacts on the extent to which how people show up. It demonstrates or helps shape the customer experience. It shapes so many things around commercial outcomes, but ultimately to the individual, when you think about people actually turning up every day to their role, it does impact their decision making and their behaviour. And I think it's really interesting if you think about an example of how organisations show those values and you can tell whether or not they're actually legitimate and they actually are truly held versus something that is purported to be their value, is when they actually put investment into something. So at Australia Post, I'll give you an example. At Australia Post, over the years I was there, safety became the absolutely critical cultural focus that we had, without a doubt. And there was a huge investment. So we saw money funneled into different equipment, different vehicles, a whole bunch of different things around training, around processes, around simplification of practices and technology that actually enabled safety. But we also saw from the top down leaders actually demonstrating and talking about or sharing stories of safety behaviours. They shared stories of when things went wrong. They owned up to things. They showed accountability. They shared things of when things went really well. It's like, hey, there was a near miss the other day. We need to talk about it. And what can we now do about it? And so what I saw in that example at Australia Post over those years was that people understood, because there was a very clear, explicit and consistent message from the top down, that safety really was important. People actually felt like, yep, our leaders actually do take my safety seriously, because they're not just talking about it, they're not using just the right words, but I can see that money is being invested in things. I can see things changing right in front of me. I can see practices changing. And I can see that if someone perhaps doesn't comply with certain rules that are actually set up to manage the safety of all the workforce and customers, that there are consequences. And I can also see that there is recognition of those people that are actually showing up as safety leaders, whether they be formal leaders or not. And I think that's really important. And if you extrapolate that to any dimension of culture, and I know, you're working with security leaders, Claire, if I think about security as an aspect of culture, think about it through that lens, then you can tell, if you're a security person, you can probably tell pretty quickly if that organisation takes security seriously or not, because they're investing in it. They're putting in place, practices, systems. They're giving someone the seat at the table. They might have a chief information security officer with the seat at the executive table, for example. Those are the organisations you can see that are actually taking security seriously, and where something that is an intrinsic value that we believe security, or a belief, we believe security is important because we care about our customers' data, we care about our people, we care about all the consequences that can happen when security goes wrong. We're actually showing up around that by investing in it in the appropriate way, and we're giving people who have the right knowledge the right voice and power and influence at the table.
I think that's a really interesting point around what they spend their money on, because that can become, I guess it's chicken or the egg. It can be impacted by the dominant culture at the top.
Yeah.
But it can also be driven by the dominant culture at the top around how they spend their money and I guess who that leadership team is. And, I can't say the word acculturation properly, but, I guess that dominant culture then filters down and has an impact on staff and how they behave and how they feel like they're expected to behave. What's your thinking, or I guess what's your definition around acculturation, and why do you think it impacts staff so much?
Acculturation is one of those fancy psychology words. For those people who haven't heard that word before, it's quite simply, just to help define it really quickly, it's pretty much just the process of adapting to a culture. And we all feel it when, I guess a really good example that we can all relate to is when we've travelled to, say, another country. Let's say if we've travelled to a new city or a country and we've never been there before, and you just by the sounds and the way people are behaving, the smells, the whole everything about the new culture is quite evident to us because we feel it and it feels very different. And in those environments, you either sort of adapt to that culture and start to shift your behaviour somewhat so that you actually don't look like a fool when you're at the supermarket or whatever because you're behaving in a different way or you don't know how the process works. You quickly adapt, or you actually experience real culture shock. And it's actually the same for organisations. So if you start in an organisation, you actually pay attention and notice all the things that are different to what your maybe past experience has been. So if you show up and in a certain environment just looks completely different, or the way that people talk to one another is completely different to what you've experienced before in past organisations, you pay attention to those things. You can't help it. You've got a little radar up. And so we all make unconscious decisions around, does this culture actually fit with me and my personal values and beliefs? Or does it feel actually quite incongruent with my own personal values and beliefs? And do I therefore make a choice to opt out of that culture, or do I make a choice to adapt? And typically what we find is that if the adaptations or the things that you need to do to fit into that culture or to adapt to that culture and therefore feel like you belong are actually relatively minor, then you're likely to do that. There's a reward there. You've got a job, you've got a great, gig, and you've probably gotten a good opportunity. So there's a benefit for you to do that. You'll probably get along much more successfully. But if the gap is so large that you feel like, geez, I'm going from who I am to this hugely different culture, actually, I feel like the gap is too big. I can't make that shift. I'm going to opt out. And that's why often we see people, you've got a probation period and people choose at the end of, say, 3 months to say, I'm out of here. This place isn't for me. And I don't think that I'm willing to make certain trade-offs to fit into that culture. And I guess the risk of that is if you've got a really strong culture that sort of permeates and that kind of reinforces certain behaviours or certain attitudes or certain ways of working that are a certain way that actually reduces diversity, that's a real risk. So you can end up with very homogenous teams, actually. We've seen that a lot in certain industries whereby the prevalent kind of culture, the environment, the way that people operate, it effectively sort of sends a signal to people that you don't belong, and therefore people do opt out of those environments. And I think that's a real risk for organisations to consider around how do we make sure that we can truly attract the best talent and actually retain them. So I think there's something to really consider there.
So I think it leads on perfectly into my next question, which was going to be around whether or not the impact of an organisation's culture on our ability to turn up every day is conscious or subconscious, because it feels like the people I speak to, particularly women in security, are very aware of their environment and, the fact, I guess, that statistically it's proven that IT security is a male-dominated environment, but it can also be a relatively inflexible environment because it's kind of this always-on culture as well. In security, it's 24/7 for a lot of people who work in it. So do you think it's a subconscious thing that the culture is impacting on us, and we only really focus on it, I guess, when it starts to impact other areas of our lives?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, many people listening here have probably experienced those times when you feel like there's some incongruence between who you are and who you want to be and the culture to which you're working in and presented with, I suppose. Look, I've worked with a lot of, women in technology in the past and have certainly observed that. And it's not just women. I'd say there's other groups of people. There's individuals who don't fit into any specific category that do feel like their culture is contrary to sort of who they are. I think the question around whether or not people are very aware of that is another matter. I'm not sure if people would always articulate it in the way that the culture is causing me friction and pain and I'm not aligned with this culture and therefore I'm going to leave. Typically the story you'd hear more often is, oh, I can't work for this boss anymore, I'm going to leave. Or I've had these really localized sorts of experiences with my immediate team or with my boss that have led me to believe that I'm not going to be successful here. So it's often not talked about in a way of talking about culture more broadly. It's often talked about what's happening for me in my immediate kind of team environment. But ultimately, what we do know is that if you go into a culture that is dominated by a particular group, it could be, I've come from HR, right? It's predominantly women. I'm actually in the flip side. It could actually feel for men turning up in an HR team that they feel like they're the minority, and in fact feel quite averse to perhaps some of the cultural phenomena that might happen in an HR team. Similarly with marketing and other functions. So I think it's something. I think the concept that we can all probably learn from is called covering. Covering is basically something that people, often women in male-dominated environments in particular, will use to basically hide their true self in order to fit in. And so they've made a call to say, well, I've invested all this. I've got this sunk cost of education. I've invested in my technology knowledge, I've become a security leader, for example, or I've done all of these amazing things from my career perspective already. I'm in it for the long haul, and therefore I've made a decision or a trade-off that in order to fit in or in order to have the job that I want, I have to behave in a couple of ways that perhaps don't really align with my true self, and that's called covering. Unfortunately, what we know is that if you are covering for too long, that can have detrimental effects on your mental health and your well-being. Right? So we see this. We see this actually particularly in LGBTI community as well, in that, I've heard some really horrific stories about people showing up to work in a very male-dominated area, say operations, and they can't talk about what they got up to on the weekend because they don't feel that that's acceptable to do so. So again, people just pretend they did nothing on the weekend or tell a bit of a story. Now that's really quite tragic, actually, if you think about the mental health effects on that. For women in technology, especially, you mentioned always on. You mentioned, people are often 24/7 and there's an inflexibility to that. Well, given that women are unfortunately still seen as primary carers in most instances, and when we have children, that can have a big impact when there's a conflict with your caring responsibilities or family responsibilities and your work expectations. And so I guess I would say from a security industry perspective, that's not the first industry that's had to think about this. There's a lot of industries that are always on that do have to think about people with different caring responsibilities. And I guess the thing that I would really encourage all organisations to think about is how do we create more flexibility for everyone rather than trying to just address it for one group? Because when you address it just for one group, that creates resentment. What we need to see is more men standing up and saying, I'm taking on more caring responsibilities at home. And therefore that frees up more women to be able to take on different hours and different sort of commitments in the workplace. And that's better for everyone.
So if we think about the idea that we want to create an experience for an employee from the start so that they don't feel like they're having to do covering and that they don't feel, I guess, like they wake up one day and realise that they're in the wrong environment. So, there's always this joke when you start in a new job, people say to you, oh, great, you came back for day 2, we can't be that bad. Tell me, I guess, in your experience about onboarding and the idea of setting people up for success from day one so they don't feel like they've been sold a turkey, but also so that they've got that longevity and retention in their roles.
I often think about the employee experience or the employee life cycle as a cycle and think about all the different moments in people's in their experience as an employee. And onboarding is one of the most critical because it's the first experience you have of an organisation, apart from the recruitment process just leading in prior to that. And really, if you have a great onboarding experience, you feel like you've been welcomed, you feel like you've had some sort of personalised experience, you feel like people have given you all the tools and information that you need to succeed and get to being productive, which is why you've been hired in the first place, quickly, then you're more likely to become an advocate for that brand. You're more likely to think about that organisation in really positive terms and therefore refer others onto the organisation and say, hey, this is such a great organisation. You should come and join here as well. I know you've got some good skills, etc. And ultimately what you want of your employees, again, I talked before about brand and culture as being two sides of the same coin. if you give people a great employee experience at all those critical moments where they're making judgments or assessments of your organization, and onboarding is one, others are things like when you're doing promotions or, job changes. Others are when people are leaving and when you have to do large scale, say, redundancies, which I've certainly experienced having to do that in the past. How you treat people has a huge impact on the extent to which people view your company and therefore your brand positively or negatively. And you want your employees to be advocates. You want them to be your greatest advocates. Like, use this, if your employee experience is aligned to your brand experience, that is very powerful from a performance perspective. You're much more likely to give customers a great experience if your employees are feeling really engaged, empowered, having a really good time. We all know that as customers, when you show up, say, into let's say a restaurant, you turn up to a restaurant before COVID, you turn up to a restaurant and you can tell if the staff are having a great time, if they're passionate about what they do, they talk about the food, they talk about this, they give you a wonderful experience. And you can also tell when you turn up to a restaurant when the staff are really perhaps feeling a bit bitter, perhaps feeling a bit resentful, perhaps not having great relationships with their leaders and so forth. It shows up in the brand experience. And I think ultimately when we think about anything relating to employees as well as customers is thinking about how do we create memorable, positive experiences at each step of the way. I guess with onboarding in particular, again, no different to other experiences, the more you can personalize the experience, the better. And that goes for customer experience as well. So if you can almost think about designing the perfect onboarding experience like you're designing a product, what would you do first? Well, you'd have some empathy for the customer needs. So you'd get to know that customer, or in this case, you'd get to know that employee. What do they love? What's their coffee order? Get them their coffee order on their first day. They rock up, there's their coffee waiting for them. That shows a really nice, simple, very simple thing to do, but that shows that you've actually taken the time to get to know that person and actually show them that you care from day one. You can also think about what are all the things they're going to need on day one versus they don't need to know this stuff yet. And if you can establish a really good onboarding experience that basically gives them all the information and tools that they need, like I mentioned earlier, from the get-go so that they can be productive really quickly, then they're going to be a lot more satisfied. They'll be far more engaged and you'll get to them a point of being able to add value over and above what they're just being there paid for. So you start to see things like discretionary effort being displayed. And I guess the thing I always think about is how do you influence things such that people turn up to work each day feeling enthusiastic and raring to go rather than showing up because they have to.
So if we then take a step back from that and you think about candidates who are looking for the right organisation for them, and I guess this is your answer to this should inform CIOs from a security perspective, what questions to be waiting for when their candidates arrive in the room. What are some things, maybe 3 things, that a candidate should ask in what is, in my opinion, a very short interview process? How do they get that vibe or that comfort by asking the right questions at an interview that they're going into an organisation that's going to align with their values and that's going to give them that employee experience?
Good question. And I always encourage people when they're interviewing for roles that they interview the leaders in the organisation to actually work out whether or not that organisation is going to be right for them. And so the first question I'd probably encourage people to ask would be, tell me about the purpose and values of this organisation. Not just the fluff, not just the words that you've got on the page over there, but tell me about how that actually shows up. What do you value in this organisation and what are some examples of that? I think that's really a good question, and it starts to test whether or not that senior leader actually has paid attention to those things. If they haven't paid attention to those things, then it becomes pretty obvious and it's possibly a red flag for me. So secondly, I would ask the leader to tell me about the actual commitments that they've demonstrated to the specific area I'm being hired into. So let's say I'm going in for a role in ISO. So I would therefore be really interested to know what have you done in this organisation to demonstrate that security is actually really important? What are the activities that you've had? What are the decisions that have been made? What are the visible signs and signals to the organisation that security is actually important? I probably refer back to when I spoke about safety culture earlier. Those sorts of things, like they've invested in, equipment and processes and practices and training. To what extent, I would say, has this organisation invested in security training? What have they done around building up champions around, culture change around security? What have they done to reach out into the external world to actually make sure they've always got best knowledge? What are they doing around development for security professionals? All of those sorts of things are signals, to me anyway, around the extent to which you actually take security seriously. And the third is kind of an extension of that second one. Hope I'm not cheating here. But it would be, show me your budget. What's your actual budget around security? What if I'm going into a security leadership role, let's say, what is my budget going to be to actually create the change that we're wanting to see here? If I was to see a budget that was not proportionate to the level of importance and proportionate to the overall IT budget, for example, then that would again be a red flag. It would be a signal that perhaps it's just something that people are saying, like security is important. Like often organisations say they care about diversity. If there's no budget for those things, then, or a very limited budget for those things, actually it tells me that it is a tick the box exercise and that it's not really critical. So I'd be absolutely asking about, show me a budget.
I actually think that's a really great question for CIOs to be prepared for in interview, because I've certainly been in interviews before where the candidate has asked about the security budget and about, would I have a standalone budget? Is it just part of the tech budget where you've got to borrow from Peter to pay Paul so that I can put some security tools in, and obviously in an interview, the CIO doesn't have to say, well, it's $5 million, but just for them to be able to say you would have a budget and it's approved budget, or we've got a process for that. I think you're right. It totally gives the candidate a level of comfort around the ability to invest, but also the desire to improve. So, I've talked about onboarding. We've talked about the recruitment process. Once a new leader is in the role, have you got any tips for that new leader for turning around a team culture that the previous leader might have left in a poor state? So, everybody, I guess, brings a culture, either brings a culture with them or creates one, if you're building out a team, which so often happens in security. You might be the first person to arrive and then you've got to put people around you, and just that process starts to create a culture. What if you get somewhere and find that you've got a team of people who the previous leader has left in not great shape?
Yeah, it's a real challenge for leaders, and certainly I think many of us have been there before and experienced that ourselves. I think the first thing to do is hold your assumptions. So it's really easy to pick up on stories, to hear the kinds of messages from some of the people you might have talked to earlier on, to hear certain things that this happened or that happened, and all these, the perhaps blame culture might have actually really gotten into its claws into that team. And so I think the really important thing, first of all, is just to stay quite impartial and to not make judgments on the former leader or make judgments on the team that was, and really see this as an opportunity to start again. But there's probably repair work required. So I think the best thing to do for any leader is to really get to know their team. So get to know people individually, find out what motivates them, what's been blocking them, what do they need in order to perform, and also do some work with the team. So one of the things that you'd probably find in that type of scenario is that trust has disappeared or is lacking. And so there's a bunch of different things that you can do to start to build trust over time with a team, and certainly between individuals in a team and yourself. And a lot of that comes down to enabling a culture of vulnerability, enabling people to be open about what's on their mind, what's worrying them, what's concerning them, and to give them a sense of empowerment around solving problems rather than encouraging almost learned helplessness. So let's change the mindset from this problem is here and it's always been here and it's terrible and we can't do anything about it, and people can start to get in that sort of negative mindset of almost whinging, through to actually, okay, we can see the problem is here. Let's almost analyse it and pull it apart a little bit, and collectively, we've got some really good ideas. Why don't we all work on it? Why don't we try and solve the problems together and feel a bit more unified in that process? And I guess it's just thinking about, again, those individuals, do they need some stretch opportunities or development or whatever, and calling out bad behaviour quickly, because if there's people in that team who have legacy behaviours that were perhaps encouraged under the former leader, it's calling that out really quickly and setting very clear expectations of that isn't how we operate anymore. This is how we operate. Let's all agree to that and let's hold each other accountable to that.
I loved all of that, but I really loved the idea about holding your assumptions. You know, they say, assumptions are the worst thing that you can do. And certainly in a new environment where you're a new leader, just collecting all that data and then synthesizing it before you take action. But then I guess also having that line drawn in the sand that says, okay, this is not how we behave anymore, is so important. But the other piece I loved about that is that learned helplessness of, well, this is the way we've already done things. So, we don't know any other way, I suppose. And the idea that someone new could come in and start to turn that ship around is exciting, but can also be probably petrifying for that team as well. So, just that softly approach of not coming in full steam, feeling like you're going to change the world, but, taking the team, it's a really bad cliche, but taking the team on that journey with you. I think that's great advice. Thanks, Fee. That was so great. I've loved chatting with you today. And I'll put all the details that we talked about today into the show notes and how people can contact you at Werkling, but also on LinkedIn. So thanks again for your time.
No worries. Thanks so much, Claire.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.